April 28, 1945. Camp Clinton, Mississippi. Sergeant Thomas Harker stood outside the mess hall watching the convoy of trucks roll through the gate, their canvas covers flapping in the humid spring wind. Inside those trucks sat something he had never expected to see in rural Mississippi: German prisoners of war. Women. Over 200 of them, exhausted, bewildered, staring out at the pine forests and red clay hills with expressions that mixed relief and apprehension in equal measure. He had served as a mess sergeant for 3 years, feeding American soldiers, Italian POWs, and more recently, German men captured in France and Belgium, but women, that changed everything. The orders had been clear: treat them with dignity. Feed them according to Geneva Convention standards. Show them that American captivity meant safety, not suffering. But standing there watching those trucks unload, Harker wondered how these women, who had spent years being told Americans were barbarians, would react to their first meal in an American POW camp. He had no idea that in 48 hours a jar of peanut butter would create a moment that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The women who climbed down from those trucks represented a cross-section of Nazi Germany's female auxiliary forces: Helferinnen from the Luftwaffe, communication specialists, nurses, administrative personnel, and women from the various signal corps units that had supported Wehrmacht operations throughout Europe. They had been captured in the final chaotic weeks of the war as Allied forces overran Germany, swept through pockets of resistance, and accepted surrenders from units that had simply run out of options. Some had been taken near Bremen when British forces captured the city. Others had surrendered near Munich as American troops pushed into Bavaria. A few had been part of the last desperate defense of Berlin before being evacuated and subsequently captured in the countryside. They ranged in age from 19 to 45, though most were in their 20s. Unlike male POWs who arrived in worn combat uniforms, these women wore a mixture of auxiliary uniforms, civilian clothes acquired during their retreat, and whatever they had been able to salvage from the collapse of the Third Reich. Many had not eaten a proper meal in weeks. The logistics of feeding German civilians and military personnel had completely broken down in the final months of the war. What food remained went to combat troops. Auxiliaries and non-combat personnel survived on whatever they could find, barter or steal. By the time they surrendered, many were malnourished, suffering from vitamin deficiencies, and desperate for anything resembling adequate nutrition. Harker had been briefed on their condition by Captain Morrison, the camp commander who had received detailed reports from the processing center in New York, where the women had first arrived on American soil. The captain had been blunt. These women have been living on ersatz coffee, black bread when they could get it, and whatever vegetables hadn't been requisitioned. Most haven't seen real meat in months. Some haven't tasted sugar since 1943. They've been told for years that if they're captured, Americans will torture and murder them. They're terrified. Your job is to show them that's a lie. Feed them well, but don't overwhelm them. Their systems can't handle rich food after prolonged malnutrition. Start with simple nutritious meals and gradually increase portions. And Sergeant, remember, these are still enemy personnel. They wore the uniform of a regime that committed atrocities across Europe. Treat them humanely, but maintain appropriate distance. Harker had nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. These women had served Nazi Germany, but they were also human beings who needed food, shelter, and medical care. The camp at Clinton had been constructed 18 months earlier to house Italian POWs, later expanded to accommodate Germans captured in France after D-Day. It consisted of rows of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing, guard towers at each corner, and adequate facilities for food preparation, medical care, and basic recreation. The camp had never been designed for women, so hurried modifications had been made in the week before their arrival. Additional shower facilities, separate latrine blocks, and privacy screens had been installed. Female guards had been brought in from other facilities. Medical staff had been augmented with nurses experienced in treating women. The first challenge came during processing. Each prisoner had to be registered, photographed, and given a medical examination. The women moved through the process with visible tension, expecting humiliation or abuse. When it didn't come, when the American personnel treated them with professional courtesy, the tension began to ease slightly. But it was still there, just beneath the surface. Years of propaganda had conditioned them to expect brutality. The absence of brutality made them suspicious, wondering when the cruelty would begin. Harker watched from the mess hall as groups of women were escorted to their barracks. Some walked with military bearing, maintaining discipline even in captivity. Others moved like refugees, carrying what few possessions they had salvaged, looking around nervously as if expecting attack. A few wept quietly, the reality of their situation finally overwhelming whatever composure they had maintained. By evening, all 216 women had been processed and assigned to barracks. Medical examinations had revealed widespread malnutrition, dental problems from years of inadequate diet, and various stress-related conditions. 3 required immediate hospitalization for severe anemia. 12 more needed treatment for infections that had gone untreated during the chaotic final weeks of the war. The camp doctor, Major Patterson, had submitted a detailed report recommending a careful feeding program to restore the women to health without shocking their systems with foods they couldn't digest. That evening, Harker and his mess staff prepared the first meal these women would eat as American prisoners. The menu had been carefully planned: vegetable soup with actual vegetables, not the watery ersatz soups they had been surviving on. Fresh bread, real bread made with wheat flour and yeast, not the sawdust extended black bread of wartime Germany. Boiled potatoes with butter, small portions of chicken, the first meat many of them had eaten in months, and for dessert, canned peaches in syrup. It was simple, nutritious, and carefully calibrated to provide needed calories without overwhelming digestive systems, weakened by prolonged deprivation. The mess hall had been divided into shifts. The women would eat in groups of 50, allowing staff to monitor how they reacted to the food and ensure order was maintained. At 6 o'clock, the first group entered the mess hall. They moved slowly, eyes taking in everything: the steam tables holding hot food, the clean plates and utensils, the American soldiers serving portions without comment or hostility. The absence of the chaos and competition that had characterized feeding arrangements in Germany during the final months of the war. Harker stood at the end of the serving line, watching their faces as they received their trays. Disbelief was the most common expression.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Disbelief at the quantity of food. Disbelief at the quality. Disbelief at the quality. Disbelief that they were simply being handed meals without having to fight for them or barter for them or steal them. One woman, perhaps 23 years old, with dark circles under her eyes and a Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform that hung loosely on her thin frame, stood holding her tray and staring at the food as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. Tears ran down her face, silent tears that she made no effort to wipe away. Another woman, older, maybe 40, took her tray with hands that shook visibly. She looked at Harker and spoke in heavily accented English. "This is for us? All of it?" He nodded. "All of it. Eat slowly. There's more, if you need it." She shook her head slightly, still processing the concept that there was enough food, that she didn't need to eat frantically before someone took it away. The meal proceeded in near silence. Some women ate slowly, savoring each bite with an intensity that spoke of long deprivation. Others ate mechanically, as if their bodies demanded fuel but their minds were still processing the shock of captivity. A few couldn't eat at all, too overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion to do more than pick at their food. Staff moved through the hall, offering encouragement. "Eat what you can. There will be breakfast tomorrow. You're safe here." Simple statements, but necessary ones for women who had spent weeks or months in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. When the first shift finished and filed out, Harker and his staff quickly cleaned and prepared for the next group. The pattern repeated 4 more times through the evening. By 9 o'clock, all the women had been fed. Medical staff reported that most had eaten adequately, though several had become sick from eating too quickly after prolonged hunger. This was expected and would improve as their systems adjusted. The real moment of transformation came 3 days later, and it centered on something so mundane, so ordinary to American life, that Harker had never considered its potential impact: peanut butter. The camp had received its regular supply shipment, including cases of peanut butter, grape jam, and white bread. These were staples of American military messes, so common that soldiers complained about them. Harker had planned to serve peanut butter and jam sandwiches as part of lunch, a simple meal between the more substantial breakfast and dinner offerings. He had no idea he was about to witness a revelation. The women had been in camp for 3 days. The initial shock of captivity had begun to wear off. They had eaten regular meals, slept in beds with clean sheets, and discovered that American guards were professional rather than brutal. The constant fear that had defined their final weeks in Germany was gradually being replaced by cautious adaptation to their new circumstances. Some had begun to relax slightly. Others remained deeply suspicious, waiting for the cruelty they had been promised would come. On the 4th day, Harker's staff set out lunch: bread, butter, peanut butter, jam, sliced cheese, and cold cuts for those who wanted them. Coffee, real coffee, not the chicory and acorn mixture that had passed for coffee in Germany. Fresh apples from cold storage. The women moved through the serving line, taking what they wanted, assembling their own sandwiches, and that's when it happened. Lena Hoffman, a 26-year-old former signals operator from Hamburg, stood at the condiments table staring at the open jar of peanut butter with an expression of complete confusion. She had never seen peanut butter before. It didn't exist in Germany. The concept of grinding peanuts into a spreadable paste was foreign to European food culture. She looked at it, looked at the jam next to it, and then looked at the American soldier standing nearby, a young corporal named Davies, who was there to answer questions and maintain order. "What is this?" She pointed at the peanut butter. Davies smiled. "Peanut butter. You spread it on bread. It's good. Try it." Hoffman took a knife and carefully spread a small amount of peanut butter on a slice of bread. She studied it suspiciously, sniffed it, and then took a tentative bite. Her eyes widened. She chewed slowly, her expression shifting from suspicion to surprise to something approaching wonder. She took another bite, this one less tentative. Other women noticed her reaction and gathered around the peanut butter jar. "What is it? Is it good? What does it taste like?" Within minutes, a small crowd had formed around the condiments table, women taking turns spreading peanut butter on bread, tasting it, reacting with surprise and pleasure. Some tried it with jam, creating the classic American combination. Others ate it plain, savoring the rich, creamy texture and nutty flavor. For women who had survived on ersatz everything for years, who had forgotten what abundant, flavorful food tasted like, peanut butter was a revelation. Harker watched this scene unfold with fascination. He had expected them to appreciate the food, to be grateful for adequate nutrition. He had not expected joy, but that's what he was witnessing. Women who had been hollow-eyed and frightened 3 days ago were now laughing, trying peanut butter for the first time, marveling at this strange American food. They spread it thick on bread, experimented with different combinations, and returned for seconds and thirds. The jar emptied. Harker sent for more. Word spread through the barracks. By dinner that evening, every woman in the camp knew about peanut butter. The next day's lunch saw a rush to the condiments table. Women who had been reserved and withdrawn were suddenly animated, discussing this miraculous American food with enthusiasm that transcended their circumstances. One woman, Greta Volker, a former nurse from Berlin, tried to explain the experience to Harker through her limited English and his non-existent German, with Davies translating. "For years we had nothing good. Everything was ersatz. Ersatz coffee, ersatz meat, ersatz everything. Then even the ersatz ran out. We were eating whatever we could find: grass soup, potato peels, things I will not describe. And now here you give us this. She held up her peanut butter sandwich. It is rich, it is sweet, it is real. You cannot understand what that means to us. To taste something real again. Something that is not just survival but actually good. It is like being reminded that good things still exist in the world. Her words hit Harker with unexpected force. He had thought of the food he prepared as simply doing his job, feeding prisoners according to regulations. He had not considered the psychological impact of abundance after deprivation, of quality after years of ersatz substitutes, of the simple pleasure of choosing what to eat rather than accepting whatever kept you alive another day. Over the following weeks, peanut butter became almost symbolic in the camp. It represented not just American abundance, but the gap between their experiences and American reality. These women had come from a Germany where everything was rationed, controlled, ersatz, or unavailable. They had lived through years where obtaining enough calories to survive was a daily struggle. Now they were in a place where food was so abundant that something as rich and unnecessary for survival as peanut butter was simply available, unremarkable to their captors but extraordinary to them. Other American foods produced similar reactions: real white sugar, which most hadn't tasted in years; chocolate, which had become a luxury in Germany by 1943 and disappeared entirely by late 1944; oranges and bananas, tropical fruits that had ceased being imported to Germany years ago; canned goods of every variety, demonstrating American industrial capacity and logistical reach. Each item reinforced the same realization: Germany had lost not just militarily, but in every measure of material capacity and societal well-being. But the peanut butter held special significance because it was so uniquely American, so utterly outside their experience. It wasn't just better quality than German equivalents, it had no German equivalent. It represented a food culture, an agricultural abundance, and an industrial capacity that was completely foreign to them. Harker began to understand that he was witnessing more than appreciation for food. He was watching the collapse of propaganda. These women had been told for years that America was weak, decadent, unable to sustain a war effort. They had been assured that German technical superiority and will would overcome American industrial capacity. Every V-2 rocket launch, every jet fighter deployment, every wonder weapon had been presented as proof that Germany was winning the technological war. But now they sat in an American POW camp in Mississippi, eating peanut butter and jam sandwiches, drinking real coffee, and confronting the reality that America had such overwhelming industrial capacity that it could feed German prisoners better than Germany had fed its own people. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Everything they had been told was being contradicted by their daily experience. Private conversations that Harker overheard, translated by German-speaking staff, revealed the impact. How can they have so much? We were told America was suffering, that their people were starving while their soldiers fought overseas. But if this is how they feed prisoners, how much must they have for their own people? Another conversation captured a different realization. Do you remember the newsreels showing American prisoners in German camps? How thin they were, how desperate. And now we are prisoners in America, and they give us peanut butter and chocolate and fresh fruit. What does that say about which side was actually stronger? The questions implicit in these conversations struck at the foundation of everything they had believed. Germany had positioned itself as superior, stronger, destined to rule Europe, but superior societies don't lose wars to inferior ones. Strong nations don't collapse while weak ones feast. The food they ate every day was evidence that everything they had been told was a lie. Harker found himself thinking about the profound strangeness of his role. He was a sergeant from Kansas who had never expected to leave the United States, certainly never expected to become an instrument of psychological warfare. Yet that's what feeding these women had become. Every meal was proof that American industrial capacity was overwhelming. Every jar of peanut butter was evidence that German propaganda had been false. Every well-fed prisoner contradicted years of Nazi ideology about American weakness. Captain Morrison called Harker into his office 2 weeks after the women arrived. The captain was reviewing reports from various POW camps holding German women, comparing experiences and outcomes. He looked up when Harker entered. "Sergeant, I've been reading some interesting observations from the guards and staff. They say the prisoners' attitudes have shifted dramatically. The initial fear and suspicion have largely disappeared. They're cooperative, even friendly in some cases. The psychologist attributes much of this to the food. Your food specifically." He paused, organizing his thoughts. These women came from a society that had been systematically starved for years. Not just inadequate nutrition, but the psychological impact of constant deprivation, of never having enough, of watching their society crumble from lack of resources. Now they're here, and we have everything. More than enough. We give them peanut butter for God's sake. Something we consider so ordinary that soldiers complain about it. And to them it's a revelation. Morrison leaned back in his chair. The brass is watching this carefully. There's a larger question about how to handle German POWs, especially women, in terms of re-education and preparing them to return to Germany after the war. The psychological people think that daily experience of American abundance is more effective than any lecture or propaganda film we could show them. They're learning through direct experience that everything they were told was false. Your mess hall is accomplishing more than any re-education program could. Harker felt uncomfortable with the weight Morrison was placing on his role. "Captain, I just feed them according to regulations. I'm not trying to re-educate anyone." Morrison nodded. "I know. That's why it works. If this were obviously propaganda, they would resist it. But it's not propaganda, it's just reality. The reality of American industrial capacity, agricultural abundance, and logistical competence. They eat it 3 times a day, and it fundamentally changes their understanding of the world." The conversation stayed with Harker. He had never thought of himself as political or ideological. He was a cook who had joined the army because it was his duty, served competently because that was his nature, and tried to do right by the people he fed because treating people decently seemed like basic human obligation. Now he was being told his work had strategic significance. It made him think more carefully about what he was witnessing. The women had indeed changed over the weeks. The fear had largely dissipated. Many were learning English, curious about America and Americans. Some asked guards about their hometowns, what life was like in America, whether the abundance they saw in camp was normal for American civilians. The answers often shocked them. When Corporal Davies mentioned that his family in Ohio had never experienced food rationing, that sugar and meat and butter had been available throughout the war, the women listening to him were stunned. "How is this possible? We have been rationing since 1939. By 1944 we had almost nothing. You fought the war and your people had everything." Davies had shrugged. "We're a big country. Lots of farms. Lots of factories. We can produce more than we need." The simplicity of his answer somehow made it more powerful. American abundance wasn't the result of some brilliant policy or supreme effort. It was simply the natural state of American society. Germany had strained every resource, extracted every bit of productivity, demanded total sacrifice from its population, and still lost. America had fought a war on 2 fronts, supplied its allies, fed its people, and still had enough left over to give peanut butter to prisoners. The disparity was overwhelming. Harker noticed that several women had begun keeping journals, writing down their experiences. This was not forbidden, as long as the content wasn't sensitive military information. He wondered what they were writing, what sense they were making of their experience. He would learn years later, when some of these journals were published, that many wrote extensively about the food, about the shock of abundance, about peanut butter and jam, and all the other ordinary American foods that represented an entire world they had not known existed. One journal entry, later published in a collection of German POW memoirs, captured the sentiment. April 1945, Camp Clinton, Mississippi. Today I ate peanut butter for the first time. It is a strange food, but good, sweet and rich. The American soldiers eat it casually, as if it is nothing special. To them it is just peanut butter. To us it is proof that we were lied to about everything. We were told America was weak. We were told they could not sustain a war effort. We were told German superiority would prevail. But they have peanut butter, and we had ersatz coffee made from acorns. They have abundance, and we had starvation. They won, and we lost. The peanut butter makes this real in a way that speeches or statistics never could. I spread it on white bread, real white bread, and I taste the truth of our defeat. Not the military defeat, which I can rationalize away. The defeat of our entire worldview. Our entire understanding of Germany's place in the world. We were not superior. We were deluded. And the peanut butter proves it with every bite. The entry was signed by Hoffman, the signals operator who had first tried peanut butter that day at lunch. Her words captured something Harker had sensed but could not articulate. The food was evidence, not propaganda, not argument, but simple material fact that contradicted everything they had been taught. As spring turned to summer, the camp settled into routine. The women worked in camp facilities, maintaining their barracks, assisting in the laundry and mess operations, and receiving basic re-education about democracy and denazification. But the most powerful re-education remained the daily experience of American abundance. Medical examinations in June showed dramatic improvement in the women's health. Malnutrition had been addressed. Weight had been gained. Dental problems were being treated. Anemia had been corrected through better diet and supplements. The women were physically healthier than they had been in years, perhaps healthier than they had been since the war began. Psychologically, the transformation was equally dramatic. The sullen, fearful prisoners who had arrived in April had become, if not content, at least adjusted to their circumstances. Some had developed friendships with guards and staff. Others had become curious about America, asking questions about American society, government, and daily life. The re-education programs reported that these women were far more receptive to democratic ideals than male POWs captured earlier in the war. The psychological staff attributed this partly to their experiences in Germany during the final collapse, which had shattered their faith in Nazi leadership, and partly to the contrast between what they had been told about America and what they were experiencing. The material abundance they encountered daily made American claims about democracy and freedom more credible. If America was strong enough to feed prisoners extravagantly, perhaps it was also right about other things. Harker found himself having conversations with some of the women who had learned enough English to communicate. One conversation stayed with him particularly clearly. It was with Volker, the former nurse from Berlin, during a quiet afternoon in the mess hall. She had volunteered to help with food preparation, and Harker had accepted because she was competent and reliable. They were preparing vegetables for dinner, a companionable silence between them when she spoke. "Sergeant Harker, may I ask you a question?" "Of course. In your country before the war, did people always have enough to eat?" Harker considered the question. "Most people. Yes. There was a depression in the 30s, and people struggled then. But generally, yes. Americans have enough food." Volker was quiet for a moment, processing this. In Germany, even before the war, many people struggled, not starvation but difficulty. Rationing began almost immediately when the war started. By 1942, obtaining adequate food was a constant concern. By 1944, it was desperation. We were told this was necessary for victory, that the Allies were suffering worse, that our sacrifice would be rewarded. But we were lied to, weren't we? The Americans were not suffering. The British were not starving, only we were, and we were told it was necessary, but it was really because Germany could not feed its people and fight a war. America could do both. Harker didn't know what to say to this. The truth of her observation seemed self-evident, but he sensed she needed to articulate it, to speak aloud the realization that had been growing since her arrival. She continued, her voice quiet but steady. I was a nurse. I saw the malnutrition, the vitamin deficiencies, the diseases that come from prolonged inadequate diet. I saw children who were permanently stunted from lack of food during their growth years. I saw old people dying because they gave their rations to their grandchildren. And all the while we were told this was necessary, that Germany was strong, that we would win. But a truly strong nation does not starve its people. A winning nation does not require its civilians to sacrifice everything while the leadership lives comfortably. I understand this now. The peanut butter taught me this. She laughed slightly at that last statement, recognizing its absurdity and truth simultaneously. Peanut butter, she repeated. Such a small thing, but it represents everything we were never told, that America has so much that even prisoners eat better than German citizens did during the war, that abundance, not deprivation, is the sign of a strong society, that we fought for a lie, and lost everything for it. Harker understood that he was witnessing something profound. This woman was reconstructing her understanding of the world based on the evidence before her. The peanut butter, the bread, the coffee, all the ordinary elements of American abundance were forcing a fundamental reassessment of everything she had believed. This was happening throughout the camp, he realized. Hundreds of women were undergoing similar transformations, their worldviews collapsing under the weight of evidence that contradicted years of propaganda. By July, plans were being made for the eventual repatriation of POWs to Germany. The war in Europe had ended in May with Germany's unconditional surrender. The camp at Clinton would continue operating until transportation could be arranged to return prisoners to occupied Germany. Some women expressed anxiety about returning. Germany was destroyed, its cities bombed to rubble, its economy collapsed, its political system being dismantled by occupying forces. What would they return to? Others were desperate to return despite the destruction, needing to find out what had happened to their families, their homes, their lives. All of them understood that the Germany they would return to would be fundamentally different from the Germany they had left. The Reich had fallen, the Nazi Party had been outlawed. Democracy was being imposed by occupying forces. Everything familiar would be gone, replaced by a new order they could barely imagine. In August, the first group of women was prepared for repatriation. Harker was tasked with preparing supplies for their journey. Standard procedure dictated providing rations for transport, but he had an idea. He went to Captain Morrison with a request. The women being repatriated are returning to a Germany where food is scarce. They'll face deprivation again. I'd like to send them back with supplies. Extra rations, things they can share with their families. Morrison considered this. The regulations allow for travel rations, but you're thinking of more than that. Yes, sir, I'm thinking we send them back with a reminder of what they experienced here. Evidence they can share that America treated them well, fed them adequately, showed them humanity. It might matter when we're trying to build a new Germany. Morrison approved the request. When the first transport left Clinton in late August, each woman carried a package containing more food than regulations required. Canned goods, chocolate, coffee, and yes, several jars of peanut butter. Harker watched them load onto the trucks that would take them to the port for transport back to Germany. Many waved goodbye. Some were crying, not from joy at leaving, but from genuine mixed emotions about departing a place where they had been treated with unexpected humanity. Volker, the nurse from Berlin, was in this first group. Before she boarded the truck, she approached Harker and handed him a piece of paper. She had written something in careful English. I want to thank you for feeding us not just adequately, but well. You did not have to give us peanut butter and jam and all the things that were not necessary for survival, but you did, and in doing so you taught us more about America and democracy than any lecture could have conveyed. You showed us that a strong society is one that has abundance to share, even with enemies. I return to Germany with this knowledge. I will share it. I will tell people that America is not what we were told, that democracy is not weakness, that abundance is not decadence. I will do this because you gave us peanut butter and in that simple act revealed a truth we had been prevented from seeing. Thank you, Sergeant Harker, for your kindness and for your country's generosity. I hope that Germany can become a nation like yours, where people have enough and no one needs to fear starvation. Harker kept that letter for the rest of his life. The camp at Clinton continued operating through the fall, processing groups of women for repatriation as transport became available. Each group left with the same supplies, the same evidence of American abundance. By December 1945, the camp was empty. All the women had been returned to occupied Germany. Harker received orders transferring him to another posting, his service at Clinton complete. He would spend the rest of his military career at various domestic bases, eventually retiring in 1959 after 23 years of service. He never forgot his time at Clinton. In later years, he would occasionally speak about the experience at veterans' gatherings or to family members. He would describe the women who arrived frightened and malnourished, the transformation that occurred as they were fed adequately, and the moment when peanut butter became something more than food. It became evidence. Evidence of American strength, of democratic abundance, of the lie they had been told about American weakness. He would reflect on how something so simple had such profound impact. We talk about winning hearts and minds, he would say. We try propaganda, re-education, lectures about democracy, but at Clinton, we won hearts and minds with peanut butter, not because we were trying to, but because the reality of American abundance was so overwhelming that it couldn't be denied or rationalized away. Those women ate the evidence 3 times a day. They spread it on bread, tasted it, and had to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been told. Most chose to believe their experience over propaganda. That's powerful. Years later, in the 1960s, some of the women who had been imprisoned at Clinton published memoirs or gave interviews about their experiences. Many mentioned the food, the peanut butter, the shock of American abundance. Several described how their time as American POWs had fundamentally changed their understanding of the world and influenced their lives in post-war Germany. Hoffman, the signals operator, became a teacher in West Germany and wrote extensively about her POW experience. She described how the cognitive dissonance of being well-fed in captivity while having starved in service to Nazi Germany had shattered her faith in the regime and opened her mind to democratic ideals. The peanut butter, she wrote, was my first lesson in democracy. Not because anyone lectured me, but because it demonstrated that a democratic society could produce such abundance that even its enemies were fed well. This was a more powerful argument for democracy than any political speech. Volker, the nurse, returned to medical practice in Berlin and spent decades treating patients in the rebuilding city. She frequently told colleagues about her time in American captivity, emphasizing the contrast between German deprivation and American abundance. We lost the war, she would say, not just because we were outfought, but because we were outproduced, outsupplied, and outfed. Any nation that gives peanut butter to prisoners has already won. Others spoke of how the experience influenced their views on German reconstruction and relations with America. Having been treated humanely in captivity, having experienced American generosity firsthand, many became advocates for strong German-American friendship in the post-war period. Their children, growing up in democratic West Germany, heard stories about peanut butter in Mississippi, about American soldiers who were kind rather than cruel, about abundance that seemed impossible to people who had known only deprivation. The story took on almost mythic qualities in some families. The moment when grandmother first tasted peanut butter became a founding narrative, the moment when old certainties collapsed and new understandings became possible. For Harker, the experience remained central to how he understood his service. He had not fought in combat, had not liberated concentration camps, had not participated in the great battles that defined the war. He had fed prisoners in Mississippi. But in doing so, he had participated in something significant. He had helped demonstrate that democratic societies could be powerful and generous, that abundance was not weakness, that treating even enemies with humanity was a strength rather than a failing. In his final years, living in a veteran's home in Kansas, Harker would sometimes be asked by visitors or staff about his most meaningful experience during his military service. He would think for a moment, considering all the years, all the postings, all the events he had witnessed. Then he would smile slightly and say, "I once watched 200 German women discover peanut butter. It changed their lives, and taught me that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply being decent and having enough to share." The story of German women POWs being amazed by peanut butter might seem trivial compared to the great events of World War II. It lacks the drama of D-Day, the tragedy of the concentration camps, the significance of the German surrender. But in its own way, it reveals something important about how wars are won and how minds are changed. Germany lost the Second World War not just on battlefields, but in mess halls, not just in combat, but in the daily reality of material inferiority. The women who arrived at Clinton in April 1945 had served a regime that promised superiority and delivered deprivation. They had believed in German strength and experienced German collapse. When they encountered American abundance in the form of peanut butter and jam, they encountered proof that everything they had been told was false. This proof was undeniable because it was experiential, immediate, and repeated 3 times daily. No propaganda could convince them that America was weak when they ate American food that was better than what German citizens had consumed during the war. No lecture could persuade them that Nazi Germany had been superior when the evidence of American industrial capacity was served on them. The cognitive dissonance created by this experience opened minds to new ideas about democracy, freedom, and what constituted a strong society. Some resisted this transformation, clinging to old beliefs despite contradictory evidence. But many underwent genuine ideological conversion, their worldviews reconstructed based on what they had experienced, rather than what they had been told. These women returned to Germany, carrying more than supplies. They carried testimony about American abundance, American humanity, and the falseness of Nazi propaganda. In occupied Germany, devastated and struggling to rebuild, their stories had power. They provided evidence that democracy could produce not just military victory, but social abundance, that American materialism was actually a strength, rather than a decadent weakness, and that treating former enemies with dignity could help build lasting peace. Harker understood that feeding people was never just about nutrition, it was about showing them who you were through your actions rather than your words. The women who tasted peanut butter in Mississippi carried that experience back to Germany, where it became part of the foundation for post-war reconciliation and the democratic transformation of West Germany. Sometimes the smallest gestures have the largest consequences. Sometimes a jar of peanut butter changes more minds than 1,000 speeches ever could. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.